There is a beginning and an end to every military operation, whether in attack or in defense. For the Sixth Army, which was lost in Army Group South and in Stalingrad, the German Army, an elite large unit of the Wehrmacht, whose soldiers were mostly born between 1916 and 1922, the attack began on the 23rd. On August 23, 1942, with over 1 million soldiers, the attack began. Green shows the furthest advance of the Sixth Army. Almost 6 months later, on the 2nd, February 1943, often wounded, in tattered uniforms, almost starved and dying of thirst, without ammunition, more than 3,000 kilometers from Germany, and without hope. Waiting for a military miracle, the last shattered units from 22 German and 2 Romanian divisions, totaling around 330,000 soldiers, had to surrender and begin the march into captivity. Only a few thousand of them made it back home. This human and military catastrophe was preceded by the events of the 19th. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet Operation Uranus, shown with red arrows, began against the Sixth Army, shown in light green, and the Fourth Panzer Army, as well as against the Romanian, shown in orange, and Italian armies allied on the flanks of the German armies, dark green. This operation had, on the 23rd, November 1942, led to the encirclement of the large city of Stalingrad on the Volga. I will share my thoughts on the main reasons for this catastrophe in another video. This report describes the last offensive action of the Wehrmacht, which, as part of Operation Hubertus, was intended to finally bring Stalingrad under German control. But first, let's take a look at Munich at that time. Since Adolf Hitler on the 8th, November 1942, during his annual speech that month, to the so-called Old Fighters at the Löwenbräukeler in Munich, he gave an example of treasonous talkativeness when he boastfully announced the German victory at Stalingrad to his party comrades and the rest of the world. In his speech, he stated, among other things,
"So if Mr. Stalin expected us to attack in the center, I did not want to attack in the center. Not just because Mr. Stalin might have believed it, but because I didn't care about that anymore. I wanted to reach the Volga. At a specific place, at a specific city. Coincidentally, it bears the name of Stalin himself, but don't think for a second that that's why I marched there. It could have a completely different name. The only reason is that there's a very important point there. That's where you cut off 30 million tons of traffic. Among them, almost 9 million tons of oil shipments. All the wheat from these vast regions of Ukraine and the Kuban area comes together there to be transported to the north. The manganese ore has been transported there. There was a huge transshipment point there. I wanted to take that one. And you know, we are modest. After all, we have it. These are just a few very small patches.
Still there. But what such boastful announcements can cause in the age of rapid communication is shown by the confidential final report of the then chief of the Soviet General Staff, Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, about this world-shaking battle. After the experiences that the German leadership had in the winter months of 1941 outside Moscow, I could not assume that Hitler would continue the Battle of Stalingrad beyond October. I distrusted all reports stating that the siege artillery freed up at Sevastopol, and the numerous engineer battalions had been identified in or on their way to Stalingrad. I had to distrust these reports all the more, especially since I learned at the same time that the 2 flanks, which had advanced to the Volga, were being shielded at their most sensitive points by second-rate troops from Romania and Italy. We suspected a trick, a cunning ruse behind which something entirely different was hidden than the deployment of a cumbersome army that was completely exposed and whose flanks were as soft as butter. Then, on the evening of November 8th, Adolf Hitler gave a speech in Munich, in which he announced that he would set Stalingrad on fire and also capture it. Revealed his most secret thoughts. He revealed the significance that control of the Volga had for German warfare, and in this speech he made it unmistakably clear that he would deploy the entire Sixth Army in the area of Stalingrad. With that, Hitler had passed a death sentence on 250,000 German soldiers. Because now I could calmly and confidently let the Soviet forces advance for the decisive breakthrough on both flanks, and thus initiate the Battle of Stalingrad, which marked the turning point of the war and broke the back of German aggression. Let's move on to October 23, 1942. On this Friday at 7 a.m., the 79th, which had been withdrawn from the Don Front, Infantry Division and Lieutenant General Richard Graf von Schwerin, together with the reinforced 54th Jaeger Regiment of the 100th von Alfith Jaeger Division, attacked the industrial district of Stalingrad. It consisted of the Red October steelworks shown here, with 10 factory halls which, like the Dzerzhinsky tractor plant and the Red Barricades artillery factory located to the south, had been fortified by Red Army engineers to resemble a fortress. A day later, they had succeeded in capturing the steelworks except for the southeastern corner, where Hall 4, the so-called Martin Furnace Hall, was located. However, the losses, also due to the large number of Soviet snipers, were heavy for the unit, which was made up mostly of Austrians from the 100th Bodydostan. The losses suffered by the 54th Jaeger Regiment, which belonged to the Jaeger Division and was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Franz Weller, were so severe that they could no longer be replaced. In contrast, the Russian losses were replenished every night with new forces. Then, at the end of October 1942, the German advance in Stalingrad had almost come to a halt. Nevertheless, after weeks of tough and costly fighting, 9/10 of the city had fallen into German hands. Only in the last part of the industrial area, in the northern part of the city, in the huge factories, were there still strongholds of the Red Army. Beyond that, the Wehrmacht units in the steppe between the Volga and the Don now also had to repeatedly fend off dangerous Russian relief attacks. Meanwhile, in Stalingrad, the commander of the Sixth Army was searching. Colonel General Friedrich Paulus was looking for fresh forces to be able to resume his attacks. On November 1st, he consulted with the commander of Army Group B, Colonel General Maximilian von Weichs, and Colonel General Wolfram Freiherr von Richthofen, the commander of Air Fleet 4, about how to take the last pockets of resistance of the Red Army and how to secure the city in terms of personnel and material before the weather got even worse. The wet and cold autumn weather had actually been replaced almost overnight at the end of October by severe winter weather with temperatures between -20 and -30 degrees Celsius, which also made both air supply and air attacks more difficult due to the raging winter storms. At the meeting on November 1st, Colonel General von Richthofen was the first to speak and accused the army commanders that things could not continue as they had with the offensives carried out so far. The artillery isn't firing, and the infantry isn't taking advantage of the bomb drops at all, so now aircraft are dropping bombs even farther ahead of the infantry, which does nothing. He also complained that, although they were repeatedly used in this way, neither the German infantry nor the artillery were trained to conduct urban and street fighting. Instead, he had suggested that, rather than sending infantry supported by tanks or assault guns into the ruins in classic-style attacks, to form smaller, mobile assault units that would have more success in the rugged terrain. But after Colonel General Paulus had rejected the Air Force General's proposal, von Richthofen contacted his friend, the Luftwaffe's Chief of Staff in Berlin, Colonel General Hans Jeschonek. He was supposed to convince Hitler to order the 6th Army to use small assault teams to destroy the last Soviet strongholds. In fact, Hitler had agreed to it, and even mentioned it in his speech on November 8th. He ordered that, in his view, only the last necessary attacks for the complete capture of Stalingrad should be carried out by small assault teams. For this purpose, 8 engineer battalions, which were ready between November 4th and 6th, were brought in. Here in the picture is Captain Wilhelm Traub, commander of the 305th Engineer Battalion, not far from the Red Barricades gun factory. Traub has been missing since January 5th, 1943. However, even the relocation of the engineer battalions had already been associated with major problems due to the poor condition of the roads. In addition, the increasingly limited rail transport capacities had become an issue. Therefore, all engineer battalions had to be flown in. The urgent request from the 6th Army to the headquarters since October 19th. The urgent request from the 6th Army to the Army High Command, which had been under Hitler's direct command since December 1941, to bring in fresh forces to support the engineer battalions, had been rejected. And Paulus for the 6th Army and von Wakes for Army Group B had rejected the transfer of the 2 infantry regiments, 15 and 71 of the 29th. Motorized Infantry Division was rejected, which, as the only reserve of the 4th Army about 10 km northwest of the city center of Stalingrad, did not want to be completely stripped of reserves. After the bitter realization that the major unit responsible for the engineer assault operation, the 51st Army Corps under General of Artillery Walter Kurt von Seidnitz-Kurzbach, here to the left of General Paulus, could no longer count on fresh infantry forces, Paulus had decided that as flank and rear protection for the attacking engineers, battle groups from the 71st, 79th, 100th, 295th, and 350th, and 398th Infantry Division, as well as the 14th and 24th Panzer Division were to be formed. However, since by now the loss of real infantry officers, non-commissioned officers, and troops had reached an almost unbearable level, many of these so-called combat groups consisted only of the remnants of the infantry regiments that had been burned out, Air Force personnel, and the still relatively large number of soldiers from the rear services, that is, from the administrative and supply units of the Army and Air Force. After the arrival of the 8th Assault Engineer Battalion with a total strength of about 2,200 to 2,400 soldiers, General von Seidnitz-Kurzbach had Major Joseph Linden, who was assigned from Engineer Battalion 672. The picture shows him later as a Bundeswehr officer, the Army Engineer Commander of the 6th, subordinate to Army Colonel Herbert Sell. Then Linden had received the order to prepare an operations plan for the final removal of the Soviet bridgeheads west of the Volga in downtown Stalingrad and in the northern industrial complexes. This was intended to secure the final German victory so that the city could be secured before the onset of winter. To support these engineers, who as mentioned were intended to operate more in small assault groups than at the company level by direct order from High Command, along with their covering companies, on the 28th. On October 28th, the first 12 Sturminfanteriegeschütz 33B assault guns were brought in. 6 each were assigned to the assault gun units. 6 were assigned to Assault Gun Battalion 177 under Major Gerhard Bochum, and the other 6 to Assault Gun Battalion 244 under Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Grosskreutz. The main armament of these heavy assault guns was a 15-centimeter infantry gun, mounted on a heavily armored Panzer III assault chassis. However, all 12 assault infantry guns were delivered without the absolutely necessary scissor periscopes. On November 11, the final decisive Stalingrad offensive was supposed to begin. It was given the name Operation Hubertus, named after the patron saint of hunters, Hubertus of Liège, whom hunters still honor every November 3rd. But before Major Linden planned his attack, he first took a look at the battlefield and was shocked, because what he saw was catastrophic for any attack with a real chance of success. In front of him stretched a vast field of ruins with demolished buildings, obstacles made of hanging steel plates, toppled chimneys, twisted steel supports, in between footpaths and countless shell craters, which were certainly occupied by the defending Soviet soldiers, had been turned into fighting positions. Behind it, the terrain gently sloped down to the Volga, where it ended at the eastern bank of the river. During the briefing with Seiblitz-Kurzbach, Linden, who was also the head of the 6th Army's Pioneer School, who was with the Army, was able to convince the general that an attack by the pioneers, who under the initial plan were to be split among various Panzer Grenadier units, would end in a fiasco. Instead, the pioneers, equipped with all kinds of explosives, were to attack one enemy position after another in platoon strength ahead of the supporting troops, and blast a breach, through which the supporting battle groups could then pour in to finally eliminate the enemy. Agreeing to this, General von Seiblitz-Kurzbach then divided the planned Operation Hubertus into two temporally separated yet related operations, Schwerin Furs and Schwerin Thau. Schwerin I was scheduled for the 13th. On November 13th, with the assigned engineer battalions, the section of terrain between the Red October factories in green and the Red Barricades in yellow was to be brought completely under German control, while a week later, on November 20th, it would be Schwerin II. The remaining pioneer assault platoons were to capture the area from the tank depot southeastwards up to the Red October plant, and at the same time they were to destroy the enemy in Hall 4 shown in light blue, the massive open-hearth furnace hall of the Red October plant, or at least isolate them. Furthermore, the plan called for the 14th Panzer Division shown in pink, and the general of the armored troops, Hans Valentin Hube, to support the pioneer assault teams in their attack on the Soviet strongpoints near the Barricades factory, with diversionary attacks on the positions held by the 13th Guards Rifle Division, which was defending the Old Town. The main final objective of Hubertus was the capture of the Volga riverbank located immediately east of the Red Barricades artillery factory. A secondary attack was to be carried out near the green-marked Red October steelworks by Engineer Battalion 179 and troops of the 79th Infantry Division. For the attack, the 79th Division was assigned the so-called Croatian Legion. It was the reinforced Croatian Infantry Regiment 369 under Colonel Viktor Pavlicic, who fell in Stalingrad on January 20th, 1943. And from the 24th Panzer Division under Major General Arno von Lenski, who after the war became commander of the armored troops in the NVA of the GDR. Two armored Panzer Grenadier battalions, the Motorcycle Rifle Battalion 4 and the Panzer Engineer Battalion 40 belonging to the division, and under Captain Rudolf Kahle. If you now look at the situation from the Red Army's perspective, the situation for Soviet Marshal Zhukov, who was sitting in his command post shown in yellow east of the Lasser chemical factory on the banks of the Volga, was as follows. His heavily battered army still held two bridgeheads, but neither of them was deeper than 800 meters. His northern sector included the Spartanovka district shown in red, while the southern one stretched with a thin strip along the riverbank at the Pavlov house shown in green, extending north to the brickyard. Indeed, his divisions had carried out several localized counterattacks successfully, with his losses being replenished by a constant flow of personnel and material replacements. By contrast, the German defender's combat strength was steadily declining. However, his ruthless conduct of battle had also led to sometimes dramatic losses. There were Soviet divisions like the 13th Guards Rifle Division, of whose 10,000 men, only 320 were still alive at the end of the Battle of Stalingrad. But Zhukov, correctly assessing the situation and anticipating another German attack in early November, had ordered the reorganization of his defensive positions together with the Chief of the General Staff, Colonel General Alexander Vasilevsky. The situation was as follows. In the north, in the area of Rhynok and Spartanovka, Colonel Sergei Gorokov was stationed in Spartanovka with a combat group of 1,000 men made up of the remnants of several brigades and an NKVD regiment. In the center of the defensive bridgehead, which stretched from the northern bank of the river at the Red Barricades factory, across the Red October factory, and the Lasser chemical factory to the Pavlov house, there were 7 relatively decimated divisions, 1 rifle brigade, and 1 rifle regiment. On their left flank, defending among other things the extensive railway facilities, the important railway junction, and what German pilots called the tennis racket because of its appearance from the air, were the reinforced 45th and 95th Rifle Division, the 39th Guards Rifle Division, and the 92nd Rifle Brigade, the 13th, and the 284th. The Rifle Division covered the Mamayev Kurgan, also called Hill 100 2.0, located north of the city center, while the 193rd Rifle Division was used as a reserve and to defend the Volga supply ferries. In the background, you can see a ferry set on fire by the Germans. Then, early in the morning of the 9th, with a freezing temperature of -18 degrees. In November, the German artillery began Operation Hubertus, with heavy barrage fire in front of their own lines. At the same time, the so-called battle groups formed within each division, as previously mentioned, carried out diversionary attacks along the entire length of the main front line, running through the city from north to south. This was intended both to pin down the Soviet defensive units and to prevent Marshal Zhukov from reinforcing the area around the Red Barricades factory. However, the Soviet artillery responded to the German barrage with such intense artillery and mortar fire that the infantry or engineer troops on both sides were unable to move until the end of the barrage. After the shelling subsided, and after a Stuka attack around 6:30 a.m., which, because the bombs fell short, also killed a number of German soldiers, the assault engineers, supported by infantry and tanks, began their attack on the Soviet positions hidden everywhere, with the opposing groups engaging in close combat with each other, sometimes only a few meters apart, using sustained machine gun fire, bundled charges, and flamethrowers. Soviet snipers, who especially targeted German officers and non-commissioned officers, repeatedly disrupted the chains of command and coordination. In addition, what experienced infantry leaders had warned about occurred: the rapid consumption of ammunition by the engineers due to intense assault fire. They also often found themselves suddenly alone in enemy positions after their assault, because the inexperienced and hastily assembled support units either did not advance with them or stayed under cover in the forward area when under fire. As a result, several successes of the engineers were undone, and they then had to fight their way back with heavy losses. Nevertheless, they managed to advance to within 600 meters of the Volga, south of the Red Barricades gun factory. The bridgehead held by the 138th Soviet Rifle Division under Colonel Ivan Lyudnikov, encircled on 3 sides, was at their rear. The Volga bridgehead, now reduced to just 700 by 400 meters, still held out until the capitulation of the Sixth Army. In the evening after the bloody and merciless close combat, often, just like in World War I, during the trench fighting with hand grenades, pistols, sharpened spades, bayonets, and knives, both sides would once again be lying in their respective positions, without ammunition and supplies. Both the Soviet and German units had suffered heavy losses in the area of the Red Barricades and Red October factories. However, up to 30% of the German forces deployed could no longer be replaced due to a lack of manpower. All in all, this attack looked like a failure. The next day, November 10th, the engineer commander Major Linden tried to convince General von Seydlitz-Kurzbach to spare his already heavily depleted engineer battalion specialists for the planned spring offensive of 1943, and instead to use fresh infantry for the further attacks, which, however, the general refused. Later that day, German troops managed to capture the so-called Commissar's house, where all the defenders were killed by so-called satchel charges. On November 11th at 6:50 in the morning, after a heavy German artillery and mortar barrage, the engineers attacked again, supported by battle groups from 7 German divisions. Especially in the southern section, the previously seemingly impregnable open-hearth furnace hall of the Red October steelworks saw the heaviest fighting, mostly in direct hand-to-hand combat, man against man. But even with artillery and Stuka support, this massive structure with its underground tunnel system could not be taken due to the constant Soviet resupply. After further heavy losses, the commander of the 79th, who was responsible for this attack, of the infantry division, Major General Richard Graf von Schwerin, ordered Captain Helmut Wells from the division's own Pioneer Battalion 179 to storm the Martin Furnace Hall once again with his significantly reduced battalion. When Wells pointed out the previous terrible losses in his battalion due to machine gun fire and snipers, his commander, who had not yet been awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, snapped at him, who had also set up his command post 10 kilometers away from the hall. I don't need your advice, and spare me your lectures. If you understand it better this way. Division order. On November 10th, you will attack Hall 4 and push through to the Volga. Understood? Helmut Wells had to carry out the order and was taken prisoner along with the rest of his engineer battalion. Major General Richard von Schwerin, though, he was promoted to lieutenant general at the end of 1942 and flown out together with the divisional staff in January 1943 to form a new division. The engineer commander Wells wrote a little later while in captivity, I cannot absolve myself of the guilt of having led an entire battalion to its doom, despite all my doubts. Yes, even against my better judgment, in the end I always said, yes, sir, when it came to carrying out unrealistic orders and sending the companies into costly battles. Of course, I was there every time things got tough. I put my neck on the line just like everyone else. But that's not enough. With that, I only given one example that proved fatal for 700 engineers. After all, he had managed to postpone the attack, which he had been so harshly ordered to carry out, by 1 day to November 11th. The only support he was given was the last remaining battalion of the Croatian 369th Regiment, with a strength of 300 men. According to his operational plan, 4 assault squads of 30 to 40 men each had been formed, which were to be followed at intervals of 30 meters by security troops and security squads. Equipment of the engineers, submachine guns, flamethrowers, hand grenades, bundled charges, explosive devices, smoke grenades, and anti-personnel mines. When the attack was launched early in the morning, the engineer forces, overloaded with their equipment and still weak, had only advanced 70 meters into the hall, but had again suffered very heavy losses. Just like the brave Croatian battalion that was pinned down by Soviet machine gun and sniper fire, which was almost completely wiped out in the process. But once again, on November 12, the completely exhausted German units, which were now being shelled by Soviet artillery almost around the clock, had to launch the next attack. The engineers under Captain Wells were supposed to, this time supported by the university, the 100th Jaeger Division, and parts of the 71st and 295th Sanindiris Infantry Division, take the commanding Mamayev Hill, green, and the railway loop, orange, the so-called tennis racket. In this attack, 440 soldiers from the engineers alone were killed. Although individual buildings of the industrial complex had been taken, and in some cases, small German assault teams had even reached the banks of the Volga, but all of them had been driven out again within a short time. By now, generals were commanding regiments that had the strength of a company, and instead of large-scale operations, they were now deciding which house should be taken on that particular day. On November 14th, the last attacks by the 50th Armored Engineer Battalion Mott and the 162nd and 294th Engineer Battalions took place in the area of the Barricades Ordnance Factory and in the north, which, apart from further heavy losses, brought no success. Then, also due to the complete exhaustion on both sides, things remained relatively quiet until the 17th. But on the evening of the 18th, the heavy Soviet attack on November 18th prompted General von Seydlitz-Kurzbach to finally halt Operation Hubertus, the last German offensive in the battle for control of Stalingrad. His units had indeed taken the so-called Commissar's House and the pharmacy, but only partially captured the factory complexes that were important for the Soviet defense. Thus, the attack on the Red October steel plant had been repeatedly repelled by the Red Army, and even the gigantic open-hearth furnace hall, despite several costly attacks and heavy casualties, remained under Soviet control. Of the approximately 3,000 soldiers deployed by Seydlitz, around 1,000 had fallen. 37 kilometers west of Volgograd, as Stalingrad is now called, is the German military cemetery Rossoshka, where 61,700 Wehrmacht soldiers have found their final resting place. From the dramatically reduced engineer forces, the engineer commander of the 6th Army, Colonel Sell, could barely form a battalion, which was consolidated under the command of Major Kruger from Engineer Battalion 162 and deployed in the combat sector of the 305th. Infantry Division was deployed as infantry. One day later, on the 19th, in November, the Soviet Operation Uranus began with overwhelming superiority, aiming to encircle and destroy the German and Allied troops in and around Stalingrad. On the 23rd, at the Sovetski railway station near Kalach, marked by a green dot, the encirclement was finally closed, trapping not only the German 6th Army inside, along with the 6th Army, which included 5 corps headquarters and 22 divisions as well as Air Force units, 2 Romanian divisions, and the aforementioned Croatian regiment were also trapped. Altogether, up to 330,000 soldiers were encircled, who became prisoners of war in February 1943, and of whom only 5,000 ever saw their homeland again. At the main cemetery in Limburg, an der Lahn, the monument commemorates all the German soldiers who fell in the Battle of Stalingrad and those who died in captivity afterward.